We like stories because that's how we see ourselves, our lives, and the lives of those that came before us, as stories that need to be told. We've always been doing that, it's just that the medium changed a bit. From inscribing on clay tablets, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, to writing them on paper, and all the way up to modern times, when we put them on a digital storing device. In modern times, though, too many of our stories have been infested with myths that simply don't appeal to us because they're way too contrary to human nature. Or maybe we can simply afford to tell more stories than ever, and the filtering mechanism is no longer that rigid. Thus, we get to see a lot of the crap that in the past didn't use to make the cut. Whatever the reason, there are still good stories, or at least stories one can learn something from out there, especially in the TV shows department, which seem to be the place where talent moved lately. So, what are the hidden gems? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alrighty, so this is part 2, very likely part 2 out of 2, of the talk about recommended TV shows. Just like in part 1, the criteria to select the shows are 1. Me having seen at least half of it, 2. Have a non-leftist message or some value for those studying propaganda or storytelling, and 3. Provide some form of practical and realistic knowledge and or wisdom. And just like in part 1, I will spill some low-key spoilers because I want to convince you to watch the shows, and because I really love spoilers myself and simply can't empathize with all the whining and fuss about spoilers. So, with that said, let us begin. Number 1. The Man in the High Castle. Now, I didn't see the entirety of Season 3 yet, but I did see more than half, so I guess it qualifies. So given that it's a contemporary TV show, I expect most of you watching have already heard about it at the very least. For those that didn't, the show is an alternate history one in which Hitler won World War II and the United States no longer exists, and what used to be the USA is divided between the Greater Nazi Reich and the so-called Pacific states controlled by Japan, with the middle, where in the middle sits the neutral zone, developed over time due to inevitable tensions that developed between the two powers after winning the war. You know, kind of like a Cold War. The show has gotten a lot of positive appraisals for the way it explores the what-if scenario, as well as the incorporation of the multiple Earths or parallel universe type of narrative, which runs through the whole show basically, because the whole show is based on some weird movies that depict situations that didn't happen in the show's timeline. Some of those movies, or I guess I should say reels, depict the situation that occurred in our times, others depict something entirely different, while others depict a situation similar with the one in the show, but with some tweaked elements, like certain people still being alive, the resistance being either stronger or weaker than in the show's timeline, and so on and so forth. And finally, other reels depicting versions of the near future, making the show incredibly complex overall. All of those are, in my opinion, a cute gimmick. But it's not for the cute gimmicks, obviously, that I recommend the show, but for its surprisingly decent depiction of a National Socialist totalitarian state. And I say decent because there are a few things that are quite bad. For instance, in the Greater Nazi Reich, we see plebs smoking in states' houses. That wouldn't have been the case, since the origin of all of the anti-smoking laws are in the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Another goof that is immediately observed is the poor usage of telephones. totally not credible given that almost 30 years earlier there were already videophones used by lower-tier city halls in the Reich. The show's action is placed in 1962 with the premise that until 1939 things worked identically as in our timeline. Well, in 1936 the Reich already had videophones. Sure, they weren't full HD or anything really spectacular, but they were a thing. So if you're building an alternative future where the Reich won the war, it's quite weird to show the Führer's office or the apparatchik's offices still featuring 1920s technology. I mean, come on, a propaganda-obsessed state like that would have paid more attention to these details. Anyway, besides these goofs, the fundamentals of depicting such an alternate universe are pretty good, and I have to admit, much better than I expected. And this is where I would prefer to direct your esteemed attention towards. In the greater Nazi Reich, there's plenty of corruption, there's plenty of leeway, and the number of truly committed ideologues in the apparatus is pretty low. It's quite spectacular how the creators figured this one out quite well. They must have had good consultants with experience in totalitarian regimes. Now, it's a bit more difficult to explain this without spoilers, but let me put it this way. At some point, someone close to one of the main characters decides to fully implement Nazi ideology on himself. And the main character, who is a high-ranking Nazi official, at one point declared a Reich hero later on, is furious and far from happy that he has surrounded himself with people loyal to the party and the Führer. And this is actually a highly accurate depiction of what happens in a totalitarian regime. Those in the inner circle rarely are the true believers and are usually the first to do their best to bend the rules in their favor and in the favor of their friends, allies, and families. A lot of controversy has been generated by the appearance in the show of J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the American Reich Bureau of Investigation, basically the post-colonization version of the FBI. To me, that wasn't controversial at all. In fact, if anyone from the high echelons of pre-World War II America would have instantly sold out to the Nazis, Hoover would have been the most likely candidate. I mean, the guy held dossiers about everyone and had no qualms in using government force to do his bidding on his dossiers. So, you know, like any totalitarian would do. This was done, of course, in the Soviet Union as well. In fact, if there will ever be made an alternate universe show with America as part of the greater USSR, Hoover should also be the head of Amerikanski Komitet Государственной безопасности, the KGB. Anyway, the man in the High Castle contains multiple winks and nods about how to operate discreetly under a surveillance state, and there are quite a few nuggets of wisdom in it which are essentially timeless and not technology dependent. One such example is the explicit suggestion that anything dangerous should be discussed either in soundproof basements or in bars full of undesirables in the most undesirable areas of the city. That's where the state is the least likely to look or to have a permanent presence for intelligence gathering. This was true in the USSR in our timeline, and it was true for the Nazi Reich for as long as it existed as well. The character of SS Obergruppenführer Smith is also quite well built, and the character that the producers are most happy with, though quite frankly I'm not. My favorite character is Joe Blake, but it makes sense the producers to be attached the most to the character of John Smith, because it's the hardest character to play and construct in the political bubble in which the script writers and the producers live. Why? Because in order for the show to be good, the prime servant of the Führer has to be, well, credible, which means human, which means difficulty, because how do you make a legit Nazi to be human? In fact, a separate show should or could be made with the struggles of those making the show. because suddenly they themselves had to ponder at the same question Jordan Peterson is asking. How and why do people join totalitarian movements, and how and why they stay in them? And that's not an easy question. And that's why Joe Blake is my favorite character in the show, because it's the character that is supposed to be struggling with this question in relation to himself. Unfortunately, at least in the episodes I have seen so far, the producers haven't dedicated enough space for this. Oh well, what can I say? It's an imperfect show, but certainly worth a watch. Season 4, allegedly the last, appears in 2 months or so you can start watching now. Alrighty. Number 2, Orphan Black. This is a show that really wanted to push identity politics, but ended up mocking it in its entirety. I don't know if it was by design, though I suspect it wasn't necessarily intentional, given that the show is Canadian and partnered with the BBC. Anyway, the show is basically a sci-fi thriller placed in present day, but in which a mad scientist not only managed to achieve human cloning, but also lost some of the clones, which are now adults, somewhat functional in society. And the clones don't know about each other, nor are they aware that they are clones. Well, that's the premise. Soon we find out that only the female clones don't know, the male versions do. It must be that patriarchy at work, but the male versions are kinda weak, because men suck. Am I right, BBC? On a more serious note, the story is pretty complex and makes for a decent afternoon binge, as the screenwriter tries to delve into the ethical questions of human nature while enriching the history with some good old institutional conspiracy, good enough to keep the viewer hooked and entertained. But it's not the story itself or why this show is on my list. Or maybe I should say, it's not the main narrative thread that makes it worthy of being on my list, but rather a more distant narrative thread that is pretty well explored throughout the show, but it's oftentimes in the subtext of the show, so to speak. The distant narrative I'm referring to is the story of the movement that culminated with the clone experiment. The movement is called Neolution in the show, and their ideology is, well, Neolutionism, and it's almost word for word taken from the transhumanist manifestos. Now, that wasn't a surprise. The surprise is the tactics used in the show, which are quite not similar to what transhumanists use in real life, but rather very similar to, well, the Frankfurt School. Dress up everything in subversive language, create think tanks, use violence when someone stands in the way, prop up surveillance. These are all very familiar. What makes Neolution a bit less credible is the idea that they were somehow able to live off the myth that their founder was 170 years old. That's credible if the show's story would have been placed in the 1930s, but it's hardly credible in contemporaneous times, especially with self-aware clones that know how to computers. Not to mention the propensity of such movements to gather around them a lot of autists with a lot of time on their hands, both as fans and as haters. Such mythology would simply not withstand for too long. But anyway, I digress. The point is that the way the Neolution is being developed in the show makes it remarkably similar to some real-life cults, such as the Greta Thunberg cult and other environmentalist cults, or the leftist cult, the more radical versions of it, you know, those who want a eugenic program to ease global warming and make us all better. Following the revelations about Jeffrey Epstein's other activities not involving children, Neolution sounds like something that could indeed be created as a cult, and even as a cult with think tanks. Human cloning is still quite far away, but once the tech will be there, and it will, something like Neolution won't be far away. Hopefully less cultish, but still. On the politics side, as I said, the show really wanted to score all the identity politics points. At one point in the show, we were even introduced to a transsexual clone, which is clearly forced into the script and not exactly part of the story. But nevertheless, the overall story is pretty conservative, since it all centers around the ability to bear children and puts on full display the dysfunctionality of patched-up families. You'll know what I mean right from the first or second episode. So yeah, Orphan Black, you should try it. It's on Amazon Premiere or, of course, on your favorite torrent tracker. Number 3, Battlestar Galactica, the 2004 TV show, to be more precise. Now, quite frankly, being an old franchise, I'm not going to go through all of the story, but rather point out some things that you should look out for, both if you have seen the series already and especially if you haven't. First, notice that the story is not a story about the future of human race, but rather about its past. So instead of appealing to imagination about how will the human civilization look like whatever years from now, it's actually looking at things from a tragic vision perspective, namely that the same mistakes happen cyclically. The whole story is centered around the conflict between humans and Cylons, which is a somewhat robotic race that is a creation of humans that is somehow also able to procreate. Well, that's a separate story in and of itself that is being told in the show. But that conflict shows a few things, such as that no matter how much you want to avoid it, everything you create inherits both your qualities and your flaws. Eventually, the Cylons get fucked because their way of organizing, a rather dictatorial and collectivistic one, is prone to a very human flaw. Sometimes the dictator ain't that smart. So the dictator, the Cavill, I think, falls prey to believing his own myth, leading him to overestimating his abilities, which in turn leads to bad decision-making. And because his status cannot be challenged, negotiated, or removed, in the end, things work out quite far away from the plan. Even though the robotic race has superior intelligence, superior forces, and at least in theory, superior wisdom, since they were, for all intents and purposes, immortal and were at least several thousands of years old, even with all of these advantages, they still get fucked. But, you know, a dictatorial collectivistic organizing is still bad. At the same time, this is one of the few shows where we get to see a highly respected and competent male leader, patriarch if you want, in the person of the character William Adama, interpreted by Edward Jones Olmos. Such a character would probably be absolutely haram today, so thank goodness this show was written in 2003. And not just the interpretation would be politically incorrect now, but the background of the character too. I mean, Comrade Adama, Commander Adama, is the son of a revolutionary lefty, which by that I mean a civil liberties lawyer, who essentially defended the Antifas of his time and other lynch mobs who weakened the previous civilization in so many ways, and yet the son ended up standing for what was civilizationally right, even if those temporarily occupying seats in the institutions occasionally disagreed. Moreover, his service inspires his son, Lee Adama, to also try to be, and eventually become, more like his father and less like his grandfather. Though in the case of Lee Adama, we get to see both facets of his ancestors when he will be quite a decent lawyer. Anyway, then there is the narrative, or maybe I should say the lesson, that you can see throughout the show. Conservative when it comes to technology is better. Tradition is better. The Cylons were able to destroy almost all of the civilization by infiltrating through the new shiny technology. Battlestar Galactica survived precisely because it wasn't a new, shiny, modern battleship, but rather a more conservative one, built to be resilient and functional and not high-tech necessarily. Well, it's all relative because they do have faster than light traveling, which is pretty high-tech. But nevertheless, being at the very least skeptical of new technology proves to be instrumental throughout the show. At several moments in the show, Commander Adama is so staunch in his conservatism with regards to technology that he's willing to risk the whole thing just to avoid potentially dangerous upgrades. And for the most part, he turns out to be right. The attitude towards technology is what I empathized with most in this show, because that's really what my own attitude is too. If something can be done with older and lower tech, then it will be done with older and lower tech, because that's the devil that we know. And then there is the whole religious and or theological discourse in the show, primarily by the speeches of Gaius Baltar, a mad scientist and an antagonist essentially throughout the show, who at some point becomes, well, a populist. You know, the wisdom of the writers is pretty astonishing here. It's a really interesting character anyway, but a lot more interesting, to me at the very least, are the positions regarding theology that are assigned to this character. Unfortunately, the producers did not explore that angle a bit more, or maybe I should say they didn't explore it enough for my taste, but it's pretty robust nonetheless. So yeah, Battlestar Galactica, a show that wasn't supposed to be serious, ended up being quite serious, a quite serious show overall, with quite a good story. Certainly, out of the space soaps out there, Battlestar Galactica is the most serious one, at least in the last 20 years. Now, okay, Stargate SG-1 was pretty serious at some point too, but that one had its debut more than 20 years ago. Anyway, speaking of shows that are from more than 20 years ago, the last two are quite literally from another era of TV shows, and are TV shows that, at least in part, I actually did watch on TV, as they were amongst the first semi-intelligent shows that made it on TV in post-communist Romania. So number 4, The Pretender. Now, by current year standards, this 1996 show sure does look a bit weird. But it was a bit weird for its time too, especially the naming of the characters and institutions, as none of them have complete names. So the premise is this: a young man named Jared escapes from the center. Yes, no last name, and the institution is just the center, and is described as just a think tank. So Jared escapes from the center and is then pursued by the center, the operation being led by Miss Parker. Again, no full name. Miss Parker has also been raised by the center and has been recalled from corporate, just, you know, the corporate, to run the manhunt to apprehend Jared. Why does the center want Jared? Because he's a pretender, namely someone with formidable intelligence that can quite easily assume other identities. Those who have seen the show probably remember the intro credits, in which some female asks, "Are you a doctor?" and the main character replies, "I am today." Now, most modern reviews of this show focus either on the weirdness of the show or on trying to compare it with other shows, and when that fails, you'll see the topic of Miss Parker's sexual desirability coming up. But it's for none of these reasons that this show is on my list, although, to be fair, Miss Parker was quite hot. But seriously, the reason this show is on my list, my list of recommendations, is because the underlying narrative thread is about loyalty, and unlike many other shows with this thread that I have seen, this show also goes to great length to create three-dimensional characters that, for the most part, do make sense. Part of the reason this happened is because the show didn't have a great budget. Remember, this was the 1990s, when limitless streaming wasn't a thing and TV shows were generally pretty stupid. So one way to differentiate in a low-budget environment was indeed to make, well, poignant characters, I guess I could say. And the other reason, in my opinion, for which the characters are pretty well built is because the show was supposed to have at least 5 seasons, if not more, and not just 4. Anyway, regardless of the reason, the fact that the characters are well built is a plus, thus making the loyalty theme better represented and thus more interesting in order for me to put the show on my list. The loyalty theme is shown from all angles: personal loyalty to someone that helped you, lifelong loyalty to someone you grew up with, and perhaps most important in the show, institutional loyalty, and how important institutional loyalty is in order for the higher goals of the institution to be furthered. And it goes really deep, which is probably why the show isn't longer, because at some point the show becomes hyper complicated from an ethical point of view, and viewers rarely come to a TV show in order to think and ponder upon complex questions. Anyway, it goes really deep into showing the differences between various types of loyalties and what are the degrees of each one. For instance, the show depicts pretty well how real life works in terms of institutional loyalty. At some point, most of the main characters find out that they've been wronged at least once in a big way by the center, and yet they all, except for Jared, stick around because the goals of the institution are more important, but also because few of them know anything else. And the latter is pretty important too, because it's an accurate description of many institutions that exist in real life, whether they're governmental institutions or private. Now, despite creating a lot of fun and inside jokes about the name, the center is an aptly named institution precisely because it prevents any debate among the viewers or any sidelining thought about the honesty of the center, thus keeping the viewer's attention on the actions of the center, which is a nice way of saying that an institution should first and foremost be judged by its actions and not by its intentions. But in addition to that, the show also offers a proper insight into what it takes to run an institution, what compromises one has to do in order to enforce the chain of command within the institution, and also puts to the audience the question about limits. Moreover, there are plenty of winks and nods to those who love discretion, the center being a very discreet institution, even though it has cleaners and sweepers whose job is to cover up the crimes committed. And also, the main character, Jared, drops in a lot of ways in which one can be discreet, suggestions that seem to be out of pace in late 1990s, but which are pretty prescient now, looking in hindsight. So yeah, The Pretender. I believe it's available on Amazon or, again, on your favorite torrent tracker. And finally, number 5, another 1990s show, The Outer Limits. For clarity, I'm referring to the show that ran from 1995 to 2002 and not the 1960s show with the same name and similar profile. The semblance with the 60s show is that this one also follows the anthology format. The difference is that this one does have recurring story arcs and an actual finale. The reason I'm recommending this show is because it's longer and, in my opinion, better than Black Mirror. Basically, The Outer Limits eventually turns out to have a unifying message, and it is worthy of being called a TV show rather than a simple anthology of entirely different movies like Black Mirror is. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Black Mirror too, and some episodes are quite good. I thought about making a video about one of them in particular. Archangel is the episode which, in my opinion, transmitted the opposite of what it intended to transmit. As far as I'm concerned, I'm totally on the side of the child on that one. But unlike Black Mirror, The Outer Limits has had roughly the same consultants, which does help with keeping a wider narrative into a direction rather than being all over the place like Black Mirror is. I won't tell you what the ending is, but I will recommend watching The Outer Limits because there absolutely is a unifying ending that makes the whole show to make sense. Other than that, it's really hard to talk about the show per se without giving out portions of the ending. But let's just say that the show goes one step further than just technology goes wrong, which is featured multiple times in Black Mirror. The Outer Limits also has been compared with The Twilight Zone, but that's unfair because the show doesn't feature anything that is a dark fantasy, and most of the show is not even really sci-fi, but more like a combination between true sci-fi, similar with Black Mirror, and some fancy sci-fi. Speaking of the Twilight Zone, if I'm allowed to make counter recommendations, don't waste your time with the revival of the Twilight Zone. It's helmed by Jordan Peele, and like anything that guy does, you're getting a sermon into the leftist cult and almost nothing of substance. So yeah. Basically, this is part 2 of the recommended TV shows. I have a few more, but I'm reluctant to make a video about them because I kind of like to keep some of the knowledge for myself or for, you know, private consultations. So what are your thoughts? Have you seen the shows recommended? And if yes, what is your take on them? After all, it's art, so it's not like there can be a definitive position on them. What other shows would you recommend? I'm taking notes on that one because at some point in the next year I will have finally finished all the shows in my queue. Because yeah, I'm busy and I don't really have time for TV shows, or at least nowhere near the amount of time that I would want. But please do make recommendations. I might be watching them at some point. Generally, I prefer the show to age a little bit, because if it's still decent several years later, then it's a good enough measure of the show passing the test of time. And as regulars of this channel are aware, what passes the test of time tends to be slightly better, in most cases anyway. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do consider a donation. If you derive any value from the work being done here, do subscribe to our social media. And I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.